Welcome to the State of Affairs in partnership with Serbian Radio Chicago. We are having conversations that matter. Joining me today, the one and only George Galloway, former MP at the British Parliament, leader of the Workers' Party, and broadcaster and host of the mother of all talk shows. Welcome.
The pleasure is mine. Thank you very much for the invitation.
So wonderful to see you. It seems like there's a lot to unpack. So I would like to start with what is happening in France. I know you follow, you have excellent commentary and excellent guests on your talk show. Europe seems to be now the center of unraveling of global politics. What is your take on the events in France?
Well, I think the chickens are coming home to roost. The policies followed by the Western European governments in particular, the most guilty of following Joe Biden's lunatic course of events, are themselves now suffering the blowback. They said they would turn the Russian currency into ruble, but the ruble is theirs. The masonry is literally falling down in Western capitals, not just in Paris, and of course throughout many other cities in France, but spreading into Belgium, even, believe it or not, into Switzerland. And the masonry isn't yet falling in other European countries, including my own. The luster is well fallen off the garden, as Joseph Borrell called it. I knew as soon as he said it, he'd end up regretting it. But yes, he described the European Union as having built a garden and much of the rest of the world a jungle. But in truth, the garden is now the jungle, and many parts of what he insultingly called the jungle are increasingly very lovely to look at. The odor of flowers and growth and harmony is everywhere except Western Europe. So as I say, you know, I'm a religious believer, so I believe that justice will prevail now or in the other life. But even if you're not, karma is a powerful thing, you know. What goes round comes round.
Well, so you mentioned the word blowback, and for instance, former Congressman Ron Paul constantly talked about blowback. And it seems like we are reaping what we were sowing around the world. Some of this is coming across the United States borders as well. I'm sure you are following what is going on within our southern borders. But we remember at some point Angela Merkel, who has opened the gates of hell, it seems, within the European Union, said this multiculturalism and diversity is not working. Is this actually at the core of what is going on in Europe and what is going on in France, or it's something else?
I don't think it's at the core, but it obviously is an issue. Some fools think that mass immigration is a good thing, but how can it be a good thing? It can't be a good thing for the country that's receiving the mass because it drives down wages, drives up rents, makes it more difficult to get a doctor's appointment or a place in the school. And obviously it isn't good news for the country that's losing the mass, because they're losing the most mobile, the most resourceful, oftentimes the most educated, the very people that are needed in their own countries to build the countries, oftentimes out of the ruins created by Western-sponsored or Western-conducted wars. Therefore, obviously, mass immigration is far from being a good thing. It can be a very bad thing indeed. But it's not the core. The core is the globalized economic system that our countries have embraced. For more than 40 years, getting on for 15 now. The idea that the nation state was sovereign, that it had inalienable rights, that it had the right to self-determination, the right to conduct its own internal affairs, were all supplemented or sublimated rather by the globalists, who believed that someone somewhere had the right to dictate what happened in all countries. This was formalized by those paragons of virtue, Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, in your very city, in the Chicago Doctrine, the so-called right to protect,
yes,
which allowed powerful countries, but only some powerful countries, it seems, the right to deem a situation necessary for their intervention, whether or not it was permissible under international law, whether or not it was endorsed by the United Nations Security Council, whether or not it would take us one step closer to international conflict, to even world war. And it's funny that I'm speaking to you now in Chicago, where this very lunatic formulation was founded. I'm a firm believer in the nation state and national sovereignty and the inadmissibility of interference in other countries' internal affairs. That doesn't mean I'm not an internationalist. I have an Indonesian wife. I have 5 mixed race children. I've represented more people of color in the British Parliament than any member of the British Parliament in all its history. So no need to try and paint me as a little Englander, I'm Scottish anyway, or as somehow lacking in internationalism. I am internationalist, but I'm not a globalist. I believe, for example, in the right of the Serbian people to have the society they choose. And as someone who very frequently goes there, I find it far more compatible with the values of my family and I than almost anywhere else in Europe.
Yes. Well, so now that we talk about globalism, it seems that the opposite of that, which is kind of rising in popularity across Europe, and I would say here in the United States, is populism. We look at Germany, AfD is doing really well in the polls. We're now obviously looking at France. Even in the UK, do you think this is the direct epilogue, I guess, of these failed policies and of the unelected bureaucrats who have been ruling over us from Brussels and elsewhere for decades now?
Well, it's undeniable that centrism is a big fat failure. And I could adumbrate the failures, if you like, starting with Macron, with Sunak, with little soldier Schulz in Germany, and so on. And when they are confronted with an adversary capable of moving the people, reaching their heart, their soul, their mind, all at the same time, they dub it populism. I never quite understood what's so bad about populism. If it's about offering people what kind of society they actually want, well, that seems to me a democratic thing.
Yes.
And what I suspect they resent is that populism, as they describe it, is oftentimes popular. But again, isn't government supposed to be seeking to be popular through implementing and pursuing the courses of action, implementing the policies that the people want? It's a kind of masochistic tendency to believe that you should lie your way into office with all kinds of false promises and then grind your own people's nose into the dirt. And if it isn't hurting, it isn't working. That's a very peculiar form of democracy for me.
Well, it seems Viktor Orban, for example, is a poster child now for some of these policies, but compared to other European nations, and especially European Union countries, Hungary is doing really well. So is Poland, but there is an effect that Europe is feeling, and many of us observing from the United States are thinking Europeans are shooting themselves in the foot through this Ukrainian conflict. What do you make of it? And especially now, raising this whole issue of edging close to the nuclear war, there seems to be a war plan consistently, no peace plan.
Well, shooting themselves in the head, ma'am, rather than
That too.
the foot. It is a kind of death wish that these very unpopulist leaders in the European Union are pursuing. Many of them, as you said earlier, not even elected. I was and am a follower of the late and great Mr. Tony Benn. I fought against the Yugoslav war, for example, under his leadership in Parliament. He used to say, if someone is taking important decisions about your life and you didn't elect them and you cannot remove them, then you are not living in a democracy. And
Yes.
how true that is today. Who elected Mrs. von der Leyen, for example? Not to one powerful position, but to two. Evidently, she's the pick for the next head of NATO, having been head of the European Union. Who picked Mr. Borrell?
Unbelievable.
Foreign policy. In what way is he speaking for truly the people of Europe rather than the unelected, deeply corrupt, unauditable? I mean, literally unauditable. It has never been successfully audited, a bit like your Pentagon. The European Union is one of the most corrupt bureaucracies ever known in the history of the world. So these people are in charge of our destiny. We didn't elect them. We cannot remove them. And even those that you could argue, would need to be argued though, that we did elect, for example, Macron did get elected, that's true, but in the first ballot, he got 23% of the vote. My candidate, Mr. Mélenchon, was only 1.5% behind that. So you could see how different it could have been. But in any case, that means that more than 3/4 of the French people did not actually want Macron as their president. They simply, in the second ballot, didn't want the other person more. And that person was Madame Le Pen. Ditto Rishi Sunak in Britain. He has never had a single vote cast for him to be the Prime Minister. As a matter of fact, on this very day, it's exactly 1 year ago, that he stabbed his boss, who plucked him from total obscurity, by the way, Boris Johnson, in the back and resigned as the finance minister, the chancellor of the Exchequer, and then went on maneuvers and overthrew the elected Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who's not a favorite of mine in any case, but at least he had the benefit of having been elected by the British people. Schulz currently represents less than 20% of the German population. If not for these bonkers Greens in his coalition government, he couldn't stay in power in any case. And don't get me started on their leader, the foreign minister of Germany, Mrs. Baerbock.
Annalena.
I've ever quite seen a politician like hers. So as I tour the horizon, what I'm really saying is the European leadership class, the political class I say European, there are many parts of Europe not represented, but in the European Union's political class, it is a very, very poor excuse for a group of politicians with answers.
Absolutely. I'd like to ask you, though, since we mentioned the unelected bureaucrats and the European Union being so corrupt, how has Brexit influenced the UK directly? What has changed since Brexit and Mr. Nigel Farage leading that on?
Well, sadly, nothing of substance has changed. I was one of the leading figures in the Brexit campaign. In fact, I'm so old that as a 21-year-old, I was on the Mr. Benn's team going around the country campaigning that Britain should not join the European Economic Community as then, back in 1975. So I'm a strong supporter of Brexit. but we haven't really Brexited. We are shadowing the European Union on foreign policy. That much is evident, but also on regulation, on economic policy, on trade policy, and so on. We're no different to the European Union. So the Sunak centrist government has completely failed to grasp the opportunity that Mr. Farage and myself and our great campaign potentially afforded them back in 2016.
Interesting. So I'd like to still kind of look into this conflict in Ukraine. It's been going on for quite a while now. We would say this little fake coup that allegedly took place with the Wagner Group and Prigozhin, big nothing burger, nothing came out of it. We are expecting an escalation. Zelensky is talking about the Russians nuking their own nuclear facilities in Zaporizhia, but you, I'm sure, followed what Senator Lindsey Graham is doing here, making sure that NATO can get involved, almost preparing the ground for something that they are themselves directing. Where do you think we are headed with this?
Well, I don't want to get too somber, but this could be the last interview either of us ever does. It's that serious.
Yes.
If NATO enters the war in Ukraine, it will ineluctably lead to the exchange of nuclear weapons. It's a simple matter of logic. If NATO was in Ukraine fighting Russia and was beginning to prevail, Russia would use its nuclear weapons because it's an existential situation for them. Ditto, if Russia was beginning to prevail and defeating NATO, undoubtedly NATO would use its nuclear weapons. Now, in the beginning, they would be so-called battlefield nuclear weapons. Not that battlefield means the fallout will be restricted to one part of the Ukrainian steppe or another, because of course the wind carries fallout everywhere. It'll even reach Chicago. It will certainly reach Britain. But of course, if the battlefield nuclear weapons started flying and one side or another began to prevail, then the same formula I've just outlined would exist. Neither side could afford, having gone nuclear, to be defeated. And so intermediate weapons would come to pass. And if you in the United States are unlucky, intercontinental nuclear weapons would not be far behind. And of course, that would mean the end of the entire world. It would mean 100 years with no sunshine, and it would mean 90% of the people and animals and plants of the world dying. And if anyone out there is not horrified by that prospect, they must have very great confidence in their prospects at the pearly gates. They must know somehow that they are going to heaven. But for the rest of us, such an outcome is so unimaginable, it is difficult to grasp how grown men and women have grasped it. But that's the track down which we are now following. Again, this very day, 5th of July, it is highly likely that the Ukrainians will seek to, at least, blow up a nuclear power plant, blame it on Russia, and Lindsey Graham's wheeze of dragging NATO into the war on that basis, triggering Article 5 of the NATO Charter, will come into being. Now, I don't know if they'll be able to blow it up. I don't know if people will be stupid enough to believe that Russia blew up its own power plant, having previously blown up its own dam, having previously blown up its own bridge, having previously blown up its own Kremlin with a drone attack. But there are a lot
Or
of
Nord Stream pipeline, for that matter.
pipeline being the most graphic example. There are a lot of sheep, and it only
Yes.
needs a few sheepdogs to shepherd those sheep, even onto the truck for the final journey. So we can't be sure that the public will not fall all over again for this maneuver. We can't be sure that all the NATO countries will go along with it. Not
Okay.
everyone in NATO is as foolish and reckless as the Biden administration and its friends in the Republican Party, like Lindsey Graham, appear to be.
Yes. The recent Kosovo crisis, in my view, the Balkans are stirring up again because Ukraine essentially is not going well for the globalists. So they do need another war someplace, and the Balkans always ripe for those kinds of shenanigans. You've been always very outspoken against the war in Yugoslavia, bombing of Serbia. As you said, you often visit, and we truly do appreciate having friends and allies. But what is your take on the recent Kosovo crisis?
Well, I think you're right. It was and is always on the back burner, can be brought to the front of the stove at any time that is necessary. It ticks a number of boxes. The Serbian population have been thoroughly demonized. They were Russia before Russia. They were sanctioned and demonized before Russia, and they remain demonized and sanctioned. And it's always a helpful or handy scapegoat or whipping boy. Ditto, the NATO powers have unfinished business there. They broke up Yugoslavia, for sure. They destroyed it, for sure. But they have not been able to break the resolve of the Serbian people to remain a dignified and united people. And this is a bone stuck in their throat. They hate to see the Serbian people, God-fearing people, overwhelmingly homogenic people, relatively monocultural people, all the things they don't like, you see. It's Serbia's very existence is a kind of bone stuck in their throat. So they would like, if they could, to regime change Serbia, to break its resolve to recover, at least never to accept the theft of such historic parts of itself as what they falsely call Kosovo. Isn't it amazing that Kosovo can be playing in the European football championships when it isn't even a country? It's not recognized by most countries in the world. In fact, I think this day someone de-recognized it.
Egypt.
Egypt de-recognized it. Good for Egypt. The great majority of countries of the world do not recognize it. Even some members of the European Union don't recognize it. But it is in the Eurovision Song Contest. That's a punishment, I know. It's in the European football championships. It is a pucka state for the worst warmongers in the world. So it can always count on them. And there's always the opportunity. There's plenty of provocations that can easily be mounted against the monasteries, against the holy places, against the dogged and courageous Serbian people who refuse to leave their land in what the others call Kosovo. They will never break that, in my opinion. I don't believe any Serbian government could ever sign off to the surrender of that, and I don't believe that any would try.
Well, interestingly, you mentioned the monasteries, and obviously hundreds, if not thousands of years of presence of Serbs in Kosovo. But a British MP, Alicia Kearns, has been spewing some incredible propaganda as of late on behalf of the ethnic Albanians from Kosovo, including the fact that the Serbs are allegedly hiding weapons in their churches and the monasteries. And this has been going on for a few days now. What is it that the Serbian government can do at this point? Because you point out Borrell and von der Leyen and the pleiad of these characters that played a huge role in the 1990s, even here from Washington, D.C., you look at Samantha Powers, everybody that played a role and created their own legacies in Yugoslavia at the time are back under the Biden administration. Victoria Nuland, the Kagans, Victoria Nuland, who was handing out muffins in Ukraine. All of these people are back at it again. What can the Serbs do, given that they're not really surrounded by friendly neighbors?
Well, obviously, I don't want to interfere in internal politics in Serbia, not least because I go there often. But for me, if I was a Serb, I'd see my future with the BRICS. I'd see my future to the east rather than to the west. Don't believe that the European Union and NATO will ever accept and embrace Serbia, except on conditions that would be unacceptable for the vast majority of Serbian people in Serbia and in the diaspora, including in your diaspora. So I think that you could waste a lot of time chasing the chimera of acceptance by Western public opinion. If it makes you feel any better, I spent 30 years in the British Parliament, but I have never heard that name you just gave me of a British member of Parliament spreading Albanian propaganda. And I keep a very close eye on events, and I haven't seen any of the results of any such efforts. So it's not the case that Kosovo and its cause have great traction on the streets of Britain, or I expect any other European country. As a matter of fact, not to put too fine a point on it, the more Kosovans British people have met, the less they've liked them.
Yes.
So it's not the case that everybody loves an Albanian in Western countries. Quite the contrary, I must say. Albanians are the biggest source of guns into Britain, the biggest source of people trafficking, the biggest source of prostitution, the biggest source of drugs. And everybody knows that. So our governments need to kind of keep quiet about their support for the Albanian cause, and therefore keep quiet about their hatred for the Serbs. I'm a Manchester United fan, as are all my sons. Nemanja Vidic is the most magnificent football figure in the memory of anybody over 45 who supports Manchester United. He will be loved until the day that he dies. They sang his name. The tennis player, Djokovic.
Yes.
Everybody loves him, not just because of his tennis playing, but because of his courage in standing up to all kinds of coercion, and the bravery with which he wrote on the front of someone's television lens just quite recently. So
yes,
Serbian water polo, Serbian basketball, Partizan Belgrade, Red Star Belgrade. My sons are wearing these shirts. It isn't the case that everybody hates you. It really, really isn't. And you need to, if I may say so, forgive me if I offend, you need to shake yourselves of that idea that everybody hates you and everyone loves the adversary.
I agree with you 100%. I truly do. And that is why we do what we do here in the United States. And as you said, there are so many contributions of Serbs to the world heritage, to the cultural heritage, to, as you mentioned, just sports. I mean, Nikola Tesla here in the United States, NASA, putting the man on the moon. These are all contributions of the Serbs compared to Albanians who truly have contributed what you just earlier listed, but somehow that hasn't translated into political realm, which is, I think, why Serbs have that element of the Stockholm syndrome. And, you know, being bombed into oblivion did not really help. And they've kept quiet for a while until we started, as you said, shaking them and saying, you need to get out there and tell the story and finally tell the truth. See, now we have an ability to tell these stories. Back in the 90s, we had CNN and BBC, and whatever they told you, that was the truth. So the public opinion was swayed through the propaganda that we are trying to break through today. And you have contributed so much to breaking down that propaganda, and I thank you for that. But lastly, I wanted to... Yes, go ahead.
Be proud.
Yes, absolutely.
Your rubric. There is nothing, far from it, quite the opposite, to be ashamed of about being Serbian. Be Serb, be proud.
Absolutely. Lastly, I'd like to ask you, just observing from the outside, we have an election coming up here in 2024. The conservatives are looking at it as possibly the existential election that we will have, with President Trump leading that America First movement. He is very popular. But again, looking from the outside in, what is the Trump effect, I guess, on the world, on Europe, and on the United States? Because there is a huge expectation that something must change here before it changes on the global stage. I am not so confident that we will get to that 2024 election, but nevertheless, I think the greatest Trump legacy is allowing the people to wake up to the fact that we have been manipulated by the globalists for the decades. And finally, now we are having these conversations about the deep corruption of the swamp, of the deep state on the global stage yet again. What do you think?
Well, I'd be a supporter of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. myself.
Yes, very interesting appearance.
I put it this way on my show in 2016. I'm not happy that Donald Trump is the president of the United States, but I'm very happy that Hillary Clinton isn't. And so that would sum up the point of view of me. I would have said the same in 2020 when Joe Biden inexplicably, maybe I'll leave it at that, inexplicably won the election in the dead of night with 82 million votes. Hard to believe. A man who can't bite his fingernails, a man you wouldn't send out for a loaf to the shops, a man who can't control his bodily functions and plainly is out of his mind. It's hard to believe that a great people like the Americans truly elected such a man. It is impossible to believe that they will do so a second time. As a matter of fact, I don't believe he'll be the Democratic nominee. I simply don't believe that he will last that long, or that if he does last that long, it will be totally credible to ask people to vote for him. He'll be, and is already, the drooling elderly relative that's an embarrassment in polite company, but has nonetheless to be brought out on certain occasions. He cannot credibly run again. So some maneuver will be, multiple maneuvers will be pulled. One of them is underway to criminalize Donald Trump, to try and put him out of the game. The maneuver to smear and demonize Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Yes.
If they cheat Kennedy, as they currently are doing, I believe that he should run as a third-party candidate. I believe he'd do very well. 7 out of every 8 votes that he took, he'd take off the Democrats, I think. So we've got a very interesting election indeed coming up. Unless, of course, it doesn't get there. One of my most distinguished recent guests, Colonel Douglas McGregor, former American military man and diplomat.
And a good friend of ours.
Yes, I did hear that. And he's very strongly of the view that you will not reach 2024, that something is going to happen, implode is his word, in the United States before that. But if you get to 24, and if they don't manage, and it would be a big ask now, to steal another election, especially if it was for Biden or Harris, then I think that Trump will be back in the White House.
Well, God help us all. Often we say, if we do get to that election, as you mentioned yourself, the way they've been controlling the votes, and I can openly say stealing the votes, not just here, but even you brought up a few cases in Europe that people are ruling democratically based on 20% of their electorate. Can we truly vote ourselves out of this mess?
Well, as Mr. Churchill said, democracy is the worst political system apart from all the others. And I think we're stuck in this paradigm. We don't have any other option other than to vote our way out of this mess. But that requires 2 things. It requires a political leadership to emerge that is worth voting for and that will make a difference if you vote for them. And I'm sorry to say, it requires fewer sheep disobeying the sheepdogs. It requires the people to vote for their own interests and the interests of their children. And you know, I have, by the grace of God, 6 children, and all 5 of them under 15. I think only, frankly, of them. I think, what world are they going to grow up in? What legacy are they going to enjoy? And everyone has to think like that. We're not here just to have a good time. It would be good if we also had a good time. We're here for a more noble and higher purpose than that, surely. All of this cannot be just about 70 or 80 years of nose to the grindstone, no problems being solved, no decent future being provided for our next generations, and everything that was sacred to us being profaned, and everything that was solid for us being melted away. And that's where we are now. I mean, you mentioned Donald Trump. Of course, I was glad that he beat Hillary Clinton. I would have been glad if he'd beaten Joe Biden.
And we're sure he did, but.
Yeah, but he didn't do in office what he said he would do. He didn't pardon Julian Assange. He didn't drain the swamp. He didn't lock them up. If he gets back in this time, no more Mr. Nice Guy.
Agreed, 100%. Fascinating. Thank you for being with us today.
You're welcome, man.